Welcome to part 2 of Crime and Punishment. We now descend into the labyrinthine depths of a fragmented psyche, where grand visions collide with gut-wrenching doubts. Raskolnikov's philosophical convictions, stemming from ego and alienation, lead him down a perilous road to devastation. His conversations with Razumikin reveal an audacious theory: that extraordinary men like Napoleon exist beyond conventional morality, acting on some higher code unfettered by societal norms. This concept echoes Nietzsche's Übermensch, but where Nietzsche saw the will to power, Raskolnikov's ideas arise from anxiety and desperation. More emotional buffer than rigorous ideology, his thoughts try to justify the unjustifiable. Dostoevsky presents a profound character study, tracing how radical notions transform into reprehensible actions that rupture Raskolnikov's soul. We accompany a brilliant mind wrestling with its innermost demons, spiraling towards acts that may forever destroy his humanity or unexpectedly open the door to redemption. Raskolnikov awakens in the early hours, tormented by the memory of his crime. He desperately searches his room for any traces of the murder, finding blood on his clothing and hastily removing the incriminating evidence. Disturbed by his actions and discovery, Raskolnikov is further unsettled when Nastasia and the caretaker inform him of a summons to the police station. His anxiety mounts as he contemplates the reason behind the summons, pondering the possibility of his crime being discovered. At the police station, Raskolnikov is consumed by fear and paranoia, half expecting to confess immediately. He encounters a clerk and a young official who inquire about his overdue rent, an issue unrelated to the murder. Initially believing the summons is related to the murders, Raskolnikov experiences a mix of relief and disorientation when he learns it's about a promissory note for his rent. This revelation highlights his mental disarray and detachment from reality. As Raskolnikov prepares to leave the station, he overhears a conversation about the murder investigation, increasing his paranoia. His fainting episode upon hearing details of the crime further illustrates his profound psychological turmoil and growing disconnection from those around him. Raskolnikov's frantic efforts to hide evidence reveal his psychological state post-murder. His meticulous attention to detail indicates both a desire to maintain control and a deep-seated fear of being caught, exemplifying themes of guilt and paranoia. The police summons acts as a catalyst for Raskolnikov's paranoia, intensifying his fear of discovery. This moment underscores his precarious mental state and the psychological impact of his crime, showcasing his conflicted nature. Raskolnikov's heightened anxiety at the police station and his contemplation of confessing reveal his deep internal conflict. This scene illustrates the psychological tension he endures, navigating through fear and guilt in a setting symbolizing judgment. The misunderstanding about the police summons highlights Raskolnikov's disconnection from normal life and societal obligations. This disconnection is exacerbated by the moral and psychological burden of his crime, bringing a complex mix of relief and confusion. Overhearing the murder investigation and subsequently fainting is a manifestation of Raskolnikov's overwhelming guilt and psychological strain. This critical point in the narrative marks the beginning of his unraveling and the increasing suspicions surrounding him. Raskolnikov is tormented by fears of a search in his apartment and the need to dispose of the stolen items. His restless contemplation and actions reflect his deepening anxiety and confusion post-murder. Struggling with where to dispose of the stolen items, Raskolnikov considers the canal and the Neva River, but ultimately decides to bury them under a heavy stone. This decision highlights his desperation and the impulsiveness of his actions. Raskolnikov realizes he hasn't even checked the contents of the stolen purse, reflecting on his indifference towards the loot. This moment underscores his conflicting motivations for the crime and his detachment from the material gain. In a state of physical and mental exhaustion, Raskolnikov visits his friend Razumikin. Razumikin's concern for Raskolnikov's well-being and offer of work contrast with Raskolnikov's erratic behavior and refusal of help, illustrating his isolation and inner turmoil. After a near accident with a whipping in the street and a woman's mistaken charity, Raskolnikov finds himself contemplating his past and present life. His actions and thoughts during this introspective moment reveal his deepening despair and disconnection from society. He also has a harrowing dream of the lieutenant thrashing his landlady, while Nastasia talks about the blood in his ears. Raskolnikov's attempt to cover his tracks reveals a shift towards a more rational approach in dealing with the aftermath of his crime. However, his disinterest in the value of the stolen items points to the complexity of his motives, indicating that material gain was not his primary intent, but rather an afterthought to a deeper, more convoluted rationale. The act of burying the stolen items under a heavy stone symbolizes Raskolnikov creating a tomb for his guilt and crime. His pride in this makeshift hiding spot, later discussed with Zamyotov, reflects his conflicting feelings of cleverness and the burden of guilt. This act also signifies his attempt to bury the crime deep in his conscience. Raskolnikov's realization that he is indifferent to the loot challenges his own understanding of why he committed the murder. This internal conflict is pivotal as it marks the beginning of his journey to confront the true nature of his actions and the moral and existential crisis that ensues. Raskolnikov's automatic, almost subconscious decision to visit Razumikin highlights his desperate need for human connection, despite his recent withdrawal from society. Razumikin's consistent support contrasts with Raskolnikov's view of himself as special and above menial work, emphasizing the gap between his self-perception and reality. The incident with the wagon and Raskolnikov's subsequent reflection on the bridges of Petersburg foreshadow future events, including Marmeladov's fate. Raskolnikov's retreat to his apartment and sleep is a recurring motif, symbolizing his escape from reality and the cycle of waking up to new challenges or revelations. The dream shows Raskolnikov's growing inner turmoil and sense of impending violence and disaster. Nastasia's reference to blood serves as a chilling but unrelated parallel to his crime, highlighting Raskolnikov's heightened paranoia and disconnection from reality. Raskolnikov wakes up in a confused state, finding Nastasia and a stranger in his room. The stranger turns out to be a representative of the man managing his mother's pension, and Razumikin, his friend, reveals he has brought a doctor to see him during his illness. The agent presents Raskolnikov with 35 rubles sent by his mother. Initially reluctant, Raskolnikov signs the receipt after Razumikin's persuasion, showing his dependency and vulnerability in his weakened state. Razumikin, having tracked down Raskolnikov's address, shares his efforts to help him, including convincing the landlady to give him more time for rent. His actions display deep concern and loyalty towards Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov decides to feign greater illness than he feels, following Razumikin's instructions meekly. This decision highlights his strategic thinking even in a state of distress, aimed at concealing his true condition and guilt. Razumikin unknowingly shares details about Raskolnikov's delirious ravings related to the crime, unaware of their significance. This ignorance causes further anxiety in Raskolnikov, who is relieved to find no evidence of a search in his room. Raskolnikov's disoriented awakening and interaction with the pension agent and Razumikin underscore his vulnerability and confusion in the aftermath of the crime. The presence of these characters in his private space symbolizes the encroaching external world on his isolated and troubled psyche, enhancing the narrative tension around his secret. Raskolnikov's hesitation in accepting the money sent by his mother, followed by his consent, reflects his internal struggle between pride and need. His eventual acceptance, prompted by Razumikin's persuasion, highlights his dependency on external support in his weakened state, emphasizing his current inability to be self-reliant. Razumikin's proactive steps to assist Raskolnikov, from finding his apartment to negotiating with the landlady, illustrate his unwavering loyalty and concern. This characterization contrasts with Raskolnikov's increasing isolation and highlights the theme of friendship and support in adversity. Raskolnikov's decision to pretend to be sicker than he is reveals his strategic mindset, even amidst his crisis. This act of feigning vulnerability serves as a defense mechanism, aiming to divert suspicion and maintain a semblance of control over his situation. Razumikin's recounting of Raskolnikov's fever-induced ravings about the crime, while oblivious to their true context, inadvertently exposes Raskolnikov's guilt. This revelation heightens Raskolnikov's paranoia and the novel's suspense, as he realizes the potential risks of his unconscious revelations, yet feels relieved that his room remains unsearched and his secret safe for now. Zosimov, a young and well-dressed doctor, assesses Raskolnikov's health and advises rest and minimal agitation. Razumikin hopes to bring Raskolnikov to Zosimov's upcoming housewarming party, where Porfiry, a police inspector, and Zamyotov, a clerk, are expected to attend. Zosimov criticizes Zamyotov for being susceptible to bribes. Razumikin interjects, discussing his defense of the house painters accused in the murder case of the old woman and Lizaveta. Raskolnikov becomes visibly disturbed upon hearing about the murders. Razumikin explains to Zosimov why the painters are suspected. One painter, Mikolai, pawned earrings he claimed to have found on the street, which were later linked to the murder scene. Mikolai's suspicious behavior and subsequent arrest further complicate the case. Raskolnikov inquires about the location where the earrings were found, realizing they might have fallen from his pocket while hiding during the crime. Despite Mikolai being held for the murders, Razumikin believes in his innocence, citing psychological evidence. Razumikin argues that the playful fight witnessed between the painters in the courtyard is inconsistent with committing a brutal murder just before. He suggests that the real murderer must have dropped the earrings while evading detection, an idea Zosimov finds intriguingly similar to a stage play. Razumikin inadvertently assembles the key figures, Porfiry, Zamyotov, and Zosimov, who will gradually become pivotal in suspecting Raskolnikov's guilt. Despite Razumikin's protective intentions towards Raskolnikov, his actions inadvertently facilitate closer scrutiny of Raskolnikov by these influential individuals. Raskolnikov's extreme agitation whenever the murder is mentioned suggests more than mere nervous obsession. Initially perceived as stress-induced, this reaction eventually leads Razumikin to suspect a deeper connection between Raskolnikov and the crime, hinting at Raskolnikov's internal struggle with his guilt. The arrest of the painters and the discovery of the pawned item create new leads in the murder investigation. Razumikin's skepticism about their guilt introduces doubt, while Raskolnikov realizes the implications of the painters finding items he dropped, fearing it adds to incriminating evidence against him. Raskolnikov's understanding of the situation, that one of the painters found an item he dropped, adds to his anxiety as he realizes this unforeseen event could link him to the crime scene. This revelation underscores his failure to account for every detail in his crime plan, increasing his fear of being caught. Razumikin's argument about the painter's behavior introduces the concept of psychological evidence in contrast to physical proof. This distinction becomes crucial later in the novel, particularly for Porfiry, who relies on psychological insights to solidify his suspicions about Raskolnikov and ultimately seeks a confession from him. This early mention of psychological analysis foreshadows the novel's deeper exploration of motive and guilt. Luzhin, Dunya's fiancé, enters the scene with a sense of self-importance, expecting a warm reception. His affected demeanor and attempts to impress with progressive ideas create an uncomfortable atmosphere, particularly when he encounters Raskolnikov's indifference and Razumikin's casual demeanor. Raskolnikov, despite being ill, quickly recognizes Luzhin and confronts him with undisguised hostility. This tension stems from Raskolnikov's protective instincts towards his sister Dunya and his disdain for Luzhin's pompous nature. Razumikin's protective attitude towards Raskolnikov becomes evident as he skeptically engages with Luzhin. His loyalty to Raskolnikov and distrust of Luzhin hint at future conflicts and his emerging role as Dunya's suitor. The conversation shifts to the pawnbroker's murder, with Razumikin sharing insights that suggest an inexperienced criminal. Raskolnikov's agitation intensifies, especially upon hearing about Porfiry's involvement in interviewing clients, which adds to his paranoia. The chapter culminates in a dramatic scene where Raskolnikov accuses Luzhin of manipulative intentions towards Dunya. Luzhin's offended departure and Raskolnikov's extreme reaction to the murder discussion leave Razumikin and Zosimov shocked and puzzled. Luzhin's self-important and pretentious behavior during his introduction to Raskolnikov is critical in establishing his character. His affected interest in new ideas and his discomfort with Raskolnikov's indifference and Razumikin's informality highlight the social tensions and character dynamics that will be central to future conflicts. Raskolnikov's immediate hostility towards Luzhin underscores his deep-seated animosity and protective instincts for Dunya. His behavior reflects his rejection of Luzhin's values and character, foreshadowing the escalating tension between them. Razumikin's skeptical attitude towards Luzhin and his protective stance towards Raskolnikov lay the groundwork for his role as a central figure in the unfolding drama. His skepticism of Luzhin indicates an underlying rivalry for Dunya's affections. The discussion about the murder investigation, particularly Razumikin's observation of the criminal's inexperience, adds depth to the narrative. Raskolnikov's heightened agitation during this conversation reveals his inner turmoil and fear of being discovered. The chapter concludes with heightened emotional tension, as Luzhin's offended exit following Raskolnikov's accusations underscores the complex relationships between the characters. Raskolnikov's strong reaction to discussions about the murder adds layers to his psychological state, revealing the stress and paranoia that plague him. Raskolnikov generously gives coins to a young street singer, but then startles and puzzles a nearby listener with a strange question about enjoying music in the rain. This interaction highlights Raskolnikov's increasingly unpredictable and bizarre behavior. At the Crystal Palace Tavern, Raskolnikov reads about the recent murders in the newspaper. In a conversation with Zamyotov, a clerk investigating the murders, Raskolnikov reveals intimate knowledge of details about the crime scene and murders that only the killer could possibly know. Raskolnikov seems to be challenging and toying with Zamyotov by voicing these incriminating details. In subsequent encounters after leaving the tavern, Raskolnikov rejects an offer of charity from Razumikin, openly flaunts his money in front of Zamyotov, observes a suicidal man about to jump off a bridge, and visits the apartment where the murders took place. This sequence of events illustrates Raskolnikov's increasingly disturbed and erratic state of mind. At the murder scene apartment, Raskolnikov touches various objects, asks probing questions about the investigation, and behaves in a highly suspicious manner that draws the caretaker's attention. His actions plant seeds of doubt that push him closer to being exposed as the killer. Based on Raskolnikov's odd mannerisms, intimate knowledge of the murders, and strange behavior, Zamyotov becomes increasingly distrustful and suspicious of him. Raskolnikov's interactions are beginning to isolate and alienate those around him. Raskolnikov's conversation with the organ grinder and his obscure question highlight the disturbing disconnect between his inner anguished state and outward actions. This interaction foreshadows his deteriorating grasp of reality and descent into madness, suggesting a mind teetering on the brink of psychological collapse. Raskolnikov's tense conversation with Zamyotov at the ironically named Crystal Palace Tavern reflects his fragmented psyche and self-destructive tendencies. The name alludes to the crystal palace of utopian ideals, critiqued in Dostoyevsky's earlier work, Notes from Underground, contrasting sharply with Raskolnikov's chaotic inner turmoil. This setting accentuates his conflict between a subconscious longing to confess and the intellectual thrill of his cat-and-mouse game, dangerously revealing incriminating details. The sequence of Raskolnikov's erratic behavior, rejecting charity, observing a suicide, revisiting the crime scene, illustrates his disturbed state of mind and growing fascination with death. Each action is a step further into his mental unraveling, painting a picture of a man increasingly consumed by his own dark thoughts and impulses. Raskolnikov's highly suspicious behavior at the actual crime scene apartment plants seeds of doubt about him in the caretaker's mind. This brings him closer to being exposed as the murderer, as his actions betray a deep-seated guilt and a lack of foresight, eroding the carefully constructed facade of innocence. Zamyotov's increasingly distrustful reactions underscore the growing suspicion surrounding Raskolnikov. His bizarre interactions are alienating those around him, reinforcing his isolation. This isolation is both a product of his own actions and a catalyst for further psychological deterioration, as he finds himself increasingly cornered by the consequences of his crime. Raskolnikov's impromptu rescue of the dying Marmeladov, crushed under a wagon, intertwines their fates, highlighting his struggle between compassion and darker impulses. Marmeladov's tragic end at home propels Katerina Ivanovna into hysteria, turning their abode into a stage for sorrow and familial despair. The grim reality of Marmeladov's impending death is underscored by the doctor's prognosis and the priest's last rites, deepening Raskolnikov's moral turmoil. Raskolnikov's financial aid for Marmeladov's funeral rites, despite his own dire circumstances, highlights the ironies of his life, contrasting his criminality with surprising acts of kindness. Amidst the chaos, Raskolnikov's connection with Polenka offers a moment of potential redemption. The chapter concludes with Raskolnikov's dramatic return home, where he is confronted by his worried mother and sister, accentuating his internal conflict and the impact of his actions on his family. Raskolnikov's involvement in alleviating the Marmeladov's misery marks a pivotal moment where he feels needed, contrasting with his isolation post-crime. This experience, as noted by Joseph Frank, triggers a release of pent-up Christian emotions in Raskolnikov, momentarily allowing him to feel as though he has escaped the metaphorical death penalty of his guilt and isolation. The priest's pious platitudes, which drive Katerina into a rage, also serve as a catalyst for Raskolnikov's empathetic response. His acts of generosity and the affection he receives in return open the floodgates to his suppressed emotions, revealing a glimpse of the compassionate individual buried beneath his tormented exterior. The gratitude and affection Raskolnikov receives, especially from Polenka, represent a significant emotional release for him. His request for her prayers, referring to himself as thy servant, signifies a momentary reconnection with his lost humanity and a yearning for spiritual salvation. The meeting with his mother and sister brings Raskolnikov back to the painful reality of his situation. As Frank observes, this reunion plunges him into an agonizing awareness of how his secret crime has severed the deep connections with those he loves, highlighting the profound impact of his actions on his personal relationships and his own psyche. This chapter, therefore, becomes a complex interplay of Raskolnikov's emotions and moral struggle. The contrast between his empathetic actions with the Marmeladovs and the painful encounter with his family underscores the deep divide within his soul, torn between a desire for redemption and the heavy burden of his guilt. As we leave Part 2, Raskolnikov's feverish inner turmoil continues unabated, leading him to increasingly desperate measures. Though he convinces himself that reason and willpower control his fate, irrational impulses threaten to destroy him. Razumikin's friendship provides faint comfort amidst the chaos, but Raskolnikov plunges deeper through crime and deceit into an abyss of his own making, which may swallow him whole. Dostoevsky renders a haunting portrait of a gifted yet tormented soul, torn between compassion and cruelty, connection and alienation. Raskolnikov's spiral into shadow, as he seeks meaning in transgression, tightens the shackles binding him to suffering. His bid for mastery over life delivers him into chaos. Yet glimmers of conscience offer hope for redemption if he can abandon delusions of control. Amidst the darkness, Raskolnikov must choose who he wishes to be. You might wonder where all this happens, and I am glad to help. The map featured in Approaches to Teaching Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment by Michael R. Katz and Alexander Burry provides a fascinating visual journey through the locales pivotal to Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, set in the heart of St. Petersburg circa 1865. Here you can trace the desperate steps of Rodion Raskolnikov, 1, from the oppressive confines of his room, plotting in solitude, to 2, the pawnbroker's apartment, where greed and desperation culminate in violence. Close by is 3, Sonia's room, a haven of sacrifice within the city's harsh underbelly, and 4, the notorious Haymarket Square, a symbol of the city's bustling poverty and vice. Additional landmarks deepen our understanding of Raskolnikov's troubled wanderings. 5. Nicholas Bridge is not just a physical crossing between parts of the city. It's where Raskolnikov's internal conflict manifests, leading him to cast away the coin he receives in a humiliating encounter. 6. Kukushkin Bridge represents another of Raskolnikov's traversed paths, both metaphorically in his fraught decision-making and literally as he makes his way to commit his fateful crime. Lastly, at 7, a local tavern at Brinko Street, formerly Tyrov-Perulok, we meet Marmeladov, drowning his sorrows in alcohol, delivering a sermon on sin and redemption, a poignant reflection of his neglectful ways, yet highlighting the unfailing gaze of God, even upon the most wretched. In Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, the Crystal Palace Tavern, a focal point in the narrative, remains a subject of debate. It might represent actual Petersburg locations, though some consider it purely fictional, particularly due to its link to Notes from Underground's utopian critique. This mirrors Dostoevsky's approach in The Brothers Karamazov, where Skotoprigonyevsk, though fictional, alludes to real places like Staraya Russa, blending real-life references with imaginative storytelling to enrich the psychological and physical landscapes of his works. Nonetheless, this map isn't merely a guide to locations, it's a narrative compass that guides us through the moral and existential labyrinth of Dostoevsky's creation, inviting us to explore the streets that witness Raskolnikov's anguish and the landmarks that echo with the footsteps of his tormented soul. As Robin Feuermiller notes in the book Approaches to Teaching Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov's strange detachment from children reveals his distorted utilitarian worldview. When he absent-mindedly leaves money for the destitute Marmeladov family, he callously thinks of Sonia. What a little gold mine they've managed to get hold of there, and profit from. He sees the family heartlessly exploiting Sonia's prostitution for money, lacking any empathy for her plight. Similarly, when asked why he no longer teaches children, Raskolnikov replies coldly that educating them is not economically worthwhile. Teaching children is very badly paid. What can you do with a few kopecks? For him, relating to children is merely transactional, assessing their monetary value rather than recognizing their humanity. This utilitarian perspective highlights Raskolnikov's severely narrowed vision, neglecting human relationships and seeing people only for what they can provide materially. His strange detachment from children stems from a profoundly distorted mindset that has obscured his ability to connect meaningfully with others, especially the innocent and vulnerable. Raskolnikov's cold-hearted treatment of children thus reflects his estrangement from moral feeling and his descent into an isolated, self-serving worldview. Thank you for spending this time with me to understand Part 2 of Crime and Punishment. All I can ask of you now is that you keep on reading, and especially Part 3, which is the next part of this epic novel.